Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for today's lecture we are going to discuss Laissez Faire. Now, before we begin our lecture proper and start our discussion on Laissez Faire, I'd just like to do our customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we looked at labor and capital and how they interacted in the later half of the 19th century. So in our last lecture, we looked at the figure of Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers, of course, being the organizer and principal mover of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. He had very narrowed goals when it came to labor groups and unionization. He wanted a plain and simple trade unionism. He wanted to go after small goals. He didn't want to change the world. He didn't want to change the American economic system. He was very comfortable in the capitalistic system, and he himself and the AFL to an extent sort of embodied the principles and the world outlook of the capitalist leaders of American industries at the time. They simply wanted better wages and better working conditions. And Samuel Gompers and the AFL had remarkable success negotiating with larger firms, smaller companies, and so forth, smaller employers that they weren't able to really grant to the AFL and people and the people that Gompers represented. They weren't able to grant them the type of recognition and status and wages that larger company firms, corporations, monopolies, whatever, however you want to define them. They weren't able to grant them the same wages or even status. So Gompers wasn't successful with them, but with larger companies and as a whole in the nation, the Gompers and the AFL were highly respected by those who favored the capitalistic system and those who were skilled laborers, and that's because Gompers hated socialism. He hated all aspects of socialism. He was against any sort of anarchist rhetoric, and he directed the members and the AFL as a whole away from such ideas, away from such associations. It endeared him to political leaders and to business leaders. Now, many of the workers, especially the unskilled workers, they grew to have a certain disdain for Gompers because Gompers he did not use the bargaining power that the AFL had to improve any of their lives. He showed no regard whatsoever for their well-being, and they reciprocated in kind by having no regard for Gompers or what Gompers were trying to accomplish, and they also formed their own trade organization, a broad, very large organization, the International Workers of the World, or the Wobbly, the IWW. And the Wobblies were the complete antithesis of what the AFL was centered on, what they were all about. They wanted to destroy the capitalist structure of the United States economy. They wanted to include all workers, skilled workers, unskilled workers. All industrial workers were to be members of the Wobblies, and the Wobblies had remarkably less success than the AFL. Wobbly organizers were targeted by employers. They were targeted by the government. Eugene Debs, who organized the Wobblies in 1900, and ran as the Socialist Party candidate also in the election in 1900. Debs was jailed repeatedly for advocating these socialist ideas, for simply holding on to his viewpoints and so forth. The Wobblies were deemed radicals, and they were blacklisted. They were whenever Wobbly would someone would whenever it would become clear that some employee was a Wobbly, he'd be fired. He would be fired. Any of his known associates, they will be fired, and they will be prevented from working in their industry locally. Anybody who drifted in, close into the atmosphere, the air of the Wobblies, they would be fired. There was a very strong current of repression where the Wobblies were concerned. Um, and now, with that being said, let's dive into Laissez Faire, because Laissez Faire, this lecture, and the lectures to follow is going to be about 3 lectures on Laissez Faire. These lectures will tell you why there was such opposition to the Wobblies, socialism, and really any sort of like bargaining with unions. And to begin with, let me just say that the period, uh, the years between 1865 and 1900 is unlike any other period in United States history. It was a transformative era that saw the political figures of the era diminish in stature greatly, while industrialists or robber barons rose in prominence. In the preceding era, politicians and policymakers were the dominant group in the republic. But after the Civil War, there was a dramatic shift. Wealthy men took center stage. Most Americans today cannot name 5 of the presidents between 1865 and 1900. And those presidents are, of course, following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865, we have Andrew Johnson. After Andrew Johnson in 1868, you have Ulysses S. Grant. Grant served 2 terms as president. He won his re-election in 1878. In 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes won the heavily contested election of 1876, and forced the compromise or the corrupt bargain of 1877 that saw the end of Reconstruction in the former slave states and the former rebel slave states, that led to redemption being complete in the rolling back of all the civil rights amendments, guarantees of freedoms, with the exception of the abolishment of slavery. Although debt peonage pretty much brought slavery back, if not fully in name, then in character and likeness. Hayes only served 1 term as president. In 1880, James Garfield, a Civil War veteran, a United States Civil War veteran, was elected president. Garfield was assassinated fairly early on in his term, and Chester A. Arthur took over as president, filling out the rest of the time for Garfield, filling out the rest of the presidency term for Garfield. In 1884, for the first time since 1856, a Democrat won the presidency. They'd 10 years earlier, they had taken control of the House of Representatives, and now they had control of the presidency. Grover Cleveland, Stephen Grover Cleveland, Big Steve from New York, he won control of the presidency in 1884. But his presidency will be a rocky one. This 1884 to 1888 presidency will be a rocky one. He lost re-election, and he lost to Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison, the Republican candidate, won the election of 1888. His presidency likewise was a rocky one. And really not much going on in terms of presidential or even like congressional greatness. Nothing like the preceding eras. Nothing like the legislation passed between the Civil War years, the Great Republican Platform being passed. Nothing like that. Nothing exciting. Nothing like the Reconstruction stuff that was passed by the Radical Republics in the early term. And even a later term of Ulysses S. Grant. Nothing like that. After Grant left office, there hadn't been any real sort of major pieces of legislation, with the exception of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Cleveland comes back in 1892. Grover Cleveland holds the distinction of being both the 22nd and the 24th president of the United States. He served 2 terms as president, but his 2 terms were non-continuous. They were broken up by Harrison's lone term. And of course, after Cleveland in 1896, William McKinley won the election of 1896. McKinley himself was a very popular figure, and his fiscal policies, they don't leave much to be desired. His policies were sound. They were good. He was rightly viewed as the right man for the right time. And McKinley won re-election in 1900. That has to be said. before he was assassinated, but we'll get to that when we talk about the Progressive Era. But those were the presidents between that era, and not many people can name those men. But on the other hand, if you ask them to name five of the robber barons, five of the great industrialists, they quickly spout out names like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and of course Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone. Now, these men, those great industrialists, are the best known figures of their time rather than presidents or policymakers or even Supreme Court justices. And that tells us a lot about the era and the time in which they lived. Now, the last 35 years of the 19th century was the heyday of industrialization. It brought about great national and personal wealth. By 1900, the United States was the second greatest industrial power in the world, second only to Hohenzollern Imperial Germany. And by the eve of World War I, the United States' industrial capacity was unrivaled globally. It was greater than the capacity of Western Europe. This era was home, and in this era, have we been covering, was also home to major social upheavals and disruptions. You had the urban reform movement going on. You had all the urban problems that we discussed. You had the immigration issue going on. You had Reconstruction was going on in the early part of this era, and then redemption came into play, and then of course Jim Crow, the early Jim Crow laws were coming into place in the Deep South. The redeemed states, the former rebel slave states. You had the settling of the Great Plains going on. You had the settling of the lower 48 and the wholesale admission of the lower 48, largely taking place by 1900. 45 of the lower 48 states had been admitted. Oklahoma wouldn't be admitted until 1907. Arizona and New Mexico wouldn't be admitted until 1912. So we had there was a lot going on with this sort of like massive enrichment going on. Now, in addition to those upheavals, there was rampant corruption and, of course, a growing gap between the rich and the poor. By 1890, 10% of American families owned 70% of the national wealth. At the same time, less than half of all industrial workers had an annual income above the poverty line. This meant that families had to put all eligible members of the family to work, and this included the children. They had to put everybody to work just to make ends meet. Now, when viewing this problem, historians and interested individuals, we tend to view it through the lens of the pros and the cons of government policy, and interpreted on the basis of the government policy of non-interference known as Laissez Faire. Now, Laissez Faire comes from Adam Smith's tract, The Wealth of Nations, and it calls for the non-involvement or the lack of regulatory controls of the economy by the national government. Smith lived in the mercantilist era, where governments created and supported chartered monopolies. Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, argued that these policies hindered the accumulation of wealth. Smith argued that if left alone, the markets would produce more wealth and will be self-regulated via the laws of supply and demand. This would allow for unfettered economic growth and progress while allowing for constant competition between individuals. Now, this was a revolutionary idea for the 1700s. The idea that wealth was not finite but could create more wealth was at complete odds with the mercantilist view that was then prevalent. Smith's ideas, along with other economic thinkers' ideas, grew in strength and popularity over the next century and came to dominate the economic thinking of the 19th century. These men have been simultaneously praised and condemned for the wealth that they helped to create and the income disparity their ideas led to. Now, there is just one problem with all of that. hands-off government. They're just all one problem with all of that, and that is this: a hands-off government policy did not exist in this era. The belief that it did is a myth. The government's policy before and during this period had been to intervene in any way possible to help business. In this era, the government aided business in numerous ways. One with taxation, namely protective tariffs that tax imports from industrial rivals. The United States has always had protected tariffs. We've discussed this in previous lectures. The first tariff was passed under the Washington administration and were primarily used to raise revenue to support the first government. Now, this was different from the protective tariffs that were designed to protect domestic industry from foreign competition that would later be passed in Washington's administration at Hamilton's behest to protect the then infant American industries. But this also allowed domestic business to maintain high prices without fear of losing out to foreign imports. And just to sort of give an overview of this, by the 1880s, over 4,000 goods were protected by tariffs. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 raised the price of some imports by nearly 50%. Now, this had enormous impact on government business. A linen coat produced in France that would have cost, let's say, $8 would cost $12. Now, this allowed a domestic manufacturer who might normally charge $9 to charge $11, and you have to keep in mind that the domestic manufacturer is protected from a cheap foreign competitor. He can raise his price. He can raise the price to gain an additional profit, and he can do this without losing any customers because he can always set his price artificially. Raise his price to be below the artificially raised price of the foreign competitor's good. This occurred at the same time had the Supreme Court was issuing major rulings against income tax that remained the guiding basis for personal taxation until 1913 with the ratification of the 16th Amendment. Now, another way government policy was aimed towards supporting and guiding the national economy was in land grants. The government gave about 180 million acres of railway of land to railway companies as an incentive to build railways. We discussed this when we looked at the Transcontinental Railway. They were handing out land grants, handing out all these acres to these rail companies so that they would build them. Now that 180 million acres, that's close to 8% of all the United States territories. Loans, financial subsidies, all sorts of aid were provided to the railway companies to ensure completion, and other businesses also received government loans and financial subsidies to ensure their success as well. Now, the third way the government actively had their hands on helping business expand and business grow was immigration. The government maintained an open door immigration policy which provided a large pool of surplus labor for industrial jobs and also homesteaders to settle on the Western Plains, to be the recipient of these industrial goods, to send raw goods to these urban centers to be processed into finished products, and then also to receive these finished products as customers. So that was another way the federal government actively had a hand in guiding and protecting the national economy. This large, continuous influx of workers kept industrial wages low. The government also encouraged the creation of new innovations and awarded patents on a massive scale to inventors. Men like Thomas Edison made careers out of either perfecting the workings of other men or purchasing the patents from other men outright. Edison was a major figure in this area, and he's most known for perfecting the light bulb. We discussed this in a past lecture, but he's most known for perfecting the light bulb and for creating the first system for generating electric power. Consolidated Edison, or Con Ed, his company, was needed to power many of its inventions. He also founded General Electric, which he later sold And General Electric went on to actually produce about 80% of the world's light bulbs by the 1910s. So great success story there. Another way the government sort of supported everything, sort of supported the national economy, did not practice laissez-faire, was in the growth of these large corporations, these large companies. They were largely sanctioned by the government. Now, even though such corporations tended to destroy competition, the corporations too depended on some very important court rulings. For one, the corporations had limited liability. Corporations were only liable to investors and stockholders for the money the investors had invested. That had not been the case earlier in history. Secondly, the courts defined corporations as having the same constitutional rights as human beings. This was the outcome of court cases from the 1880s. Now, labor unions were then defined as constraints on trade, whose strikes could be halted by court injunctions. This allowed for corporate monopolies to receive protection from state regulation via the 14th Amendment Protection Clause. Also, labor unions were prosecuted under the 1890 Sherman Act, that was actually designed to crack down on monopolies. It was used to crack down on trade unions. Now, the 1895 E.C. Knight sugar case saw the court rule that Congress did not have the right to regulate manufacturing at all. This was a great boon to monopolies and to industrialists alike. This meant that they were now free from congressional oversight when it came to manufacturing. Now, the government also used court injunctions and armed forces, namely the state militias and regular armies to break down labor strikes. Now, none of this is laissez-faire. None of this is laissez-faire at all, but rather constitutes a vigorous, hands-on approach by the government to support businesses. It is really in line with the policies of the Republic. All the way back to the founding. The hands-on approach to the economy can be traced all the way back to the founding of the First National Bank and Hamilton's first three reports to Congress on the state of the Republic's economic and those economic reports were really reports on the industrial capacity of the Republic. But this hands-on approach can all be traced back then, and in particular in the case of the National Bank. Now, the National Bank. The First National Bank was not a monopoly. There were other banks, to be certain, in the early Republic, in the 1790s. But the First National Bank, the National Bank, did have regulatory powers, great regulatory powers over other banks. The First National Bank also played a critical role in economic growth and development in the early Republic, as we discussed under when we looked at the first administration. Now, at the same time, it is true that the Second National Bank functioned largely had a government-sponsored monopoly as well, and largely a more engrossed, a more powerful government monopoly. The first protective tariffs had to be stated earlier in this lecture, and as we stated in the lecture on the first administration. Those first protective tariffs that Hamilton pushed for, they were to protect the new domestic industries, those infant American industries, from British competition. The early internal improvement projects, like the Erie Canal, were funded by the government. Remember, Governor DeWitt Clinton had to float a very risky bond proposal to get the funding so that New York State can bear the lion's weight of building that Erie Canal. It worked out very well for DeWitt Clinton. He was reelected as governor, and he earned the undying support of New York working men because they knew him as the guy who ensured they had jobs. And of course, all of this largely served to generate economic gains. To protect the tariffs, the Erie Canal, they all served to generate large economic gains. Now, have we discussed when we were looking at when we were looking at early internal improvements, and we were looking at the 1820s, not all Americans were in favor of this. Not all Americans not all Americans approved of government support or government intervention in the economy at all. Back then, slavery was the big thing, and everyone was slave owners themselves were very afraid that if the government started to interfere in the economy, then they would find the nerve, then they would find the ability, the reason to intervene against slavery. So a lot of slaveholders began to oppose government intervention, and not just slave owners. This was also felt by other non-slave holding elites in the early republic. They also began to oppose government intervention, seeing it as if the government came in, then the government might protect their workers or might view what they're doing as being wrong somehow. So they didn't want any government intervention at all. They wanted a free hand. They wanted a free reign in doing and conducting their business as they saw fit. For those people, the person they flocked to was Andrew Jackson, and it's the early Jacksonian Democrats who opposed government intervention uniformly. And this is echoed by Jackson's opposition to the Maysville Road Turnpike, and also his opposition to providing federal funds to any group. Jackson's veto and destruction of the Second National Bank was also now Jackson's veto and destruction of the Second National Bank serves as both an act of opposition to government intervention, but it also serves as an example of government intervention, because Jackson went in and destroyed the National Bank at the behest of many other bankers. The Second National Bank was opposed by bankers and the early leaders of Wall Street. So it's sort of unique. It's in both camps. It has one foot on the left and one foot on the right. The destruction of the Second National Bank. Now, their advocacy and support of Jackson's actions were driven from their desire to break free from the overall oversight and control of the Second National Bank, the bankers and the Wall Street brokers, the early Wall Street leaders. And we must also remember that the Jacksonian Democrats evolved into the Democratic Party of the 19th century, and their opponents evolved into the Whigs, who eventually evolved into the Republican Party of the 19th century. So we have to keep those two caveats in mind as we continue our discussion on Laissez Faire. Now, for now, we'll break here, and we'll come back with part 2 of our lecture series, of our lecture on Laissez Faire. And as always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. And do comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. And I'll see you guys next time.